You know what one of the perks of having your internet back is? You can wake up and watch an anime series whenever you want. Hey, it's Romania Black! And yes, I finally have my internet back, which means I can watch Apothecary Diaries on the weekends whenever I want. And the new episode just came out yesterday, so I'm recording it this morning. I was like, man, because when my internet was out, I would have to wait usually until I got the internet episodes from someone else. But usually by the time that they could get them into me, it was like Sunday. And by the time I downloaded them on my computer, which took forever, it would be like Monday before I could watch them. Then they had to have them edited and ready to go by Wednesday. So the last 3 weeks have been a lot of planning and skirting around things. But now I'm like, oh, wait, the episode came out yesterday. It's Saturday morning as I'm recording this. I've got my coffee. I can go ahead and watch the episode. And it's such a great feeling. So that's what we're doing. But we're on episode 4. Last episode was really good. I thought it was a really good standalone episode. The corpse fungus thing. I was very glad because at the beginning of the episode, Jinshi and MaoMao were very much like a business official with one another. And by the end of the episode, they were just goofing off again, which is my favorite Jinshi and MaoMao interactions when they just goof off with each other. But we've got some comments that I want to dive into before we jump into episode 4. And since it was a one-off episode last week, I'm like, I don't know where we're going this week. Obviously, the envoy with those 2 twins are making their way here to do whatever. So we've got to wait and see on that, but we'll see what happens in the meantime. However, I want to make note from episode 2, there were 2 specific comments from G the Wolf as well as Algumalgum. G the Wolf said there was an error in the translation where MaoMao talks about the fertility of the tea to Jinshi. Jasmine tea helps with male fertility, not decrease it. And so, yeah, then Algumalgum says the joke is meant to be... We'll talk about Algumalgum's comment in a minute because I had extra about that. But yeah, I was like, really? Because nobody on Patreon had said anything about it, which I have been pretty adamant about spoilers and things like that. But the mods had cleared that comment, so I'm like, okay, we should be good. So I did go and look it up. Yeah, jasmine tea actually does help with fertility amongst men. It helps with sperm count. And I was like, oh, okay. So... that means it was kind of a joke when MaoMao's like, oh, if you drink this tea, it's going to help your sperm count, your erections and everything. Not that you get any of those. And then Jinshi's like, well, I feel like that adds a whole new layer to it. A whole new layer. Because Jinshi, you know, maybe he feels guilty in the moment being like, I'm lying to MaoMao, who I care about. I'm lying to her and telling her that I'm a eunuch when I'm really not. So the joke doesn't really land for a reason that MaoMao doesn't even understand. And I feel that knowing Jinshi's personality, he probably feels a little bit guilty about that because he's lying to this person that he cares about, but he has to lie, so there's not much he can do about it. But then Algumalgum says the joke is meant to be that it's a benefit she believes Jinshi has no use for. But Jinshi drank the tea because believing MaoMao's claim about it and hoping to mitigate fertility issues of the drug that he's taking to fake being a eunuch. I'm not sure if he's concerned about actual fertility, but instead his libido or the ability to have an erection. Yeah, they had more in their comment that was talking about Jinshi being concerned about his fertility. I don't know about that. I don't think Jinshi cares about having children or not, especially given the position as the spare that he's in. I think that's kind of tainted his whole entire idea of having children. I mean, maybe he does want children eventually, but I think he's more concerned about getting to where he doesn't have to be in line for succession or have anything to do with the emperor or that position. So I think he's more concerned about that. But yeah, it may just be that, you know, considering his masculinity, he wants to be like, yeah, I'd like to be able to have an erection. I don't want to be impotent. So, okay. But yeah, I think that it does add an extra layer of Jinshi's guilt about lying to MaoMao. And then him being like, well, I have to say this to keep up the ruse, but as time goes on and they get closer, that may become more of a challenge because then it's like, is Jinshi just lying to her and being like, yeah, I'm a eunuch? And then the reality is, no, you're not. So we'll see where that goes. But I'm glad that you all pointed that out. That was really helpful. Ichu says that MaoMao and Jinshi's scene in episode 3 reminds me of the mushroom season in a Chinese province, where people go out foraging for mushrooms in the woods, and of course, with interesting results. Now, interesting results, my mind went into the gutter, and I was like, oh, they go foraging for mushrooms, huh? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But then they were like, oh no, they get high. And I was like, oh, yeah, of course. high on them hallucinogenic mushrooms out in the woods. Honestly, Jinshi high on shrooms would be, I've never had shrooms, nor do I intend to, but I've had friends that have, and I've been like, okay, y'all are fine. Although I would usually be the sober one that would be the caretaker over people that would partake in that. Like, if you want to do that, it's your body, you do whatever you want to. I'll casually be here to support you in your endeavors. But yeah, I feel like a perfect date for Jinshi and MaoMao would be Jinshi taking MaoMao to go forage for mushrooms, and she could geek out about it and it'd be adorable, and Jinshi would think it's the cutest thing, and Jinshi would get out of his comfort zone. So it'd be a fun time. Amelia Jean-Claus says for episode 3, I also feel like this particular mystery, this ties into the whole thing with Lolan and Shisui. I feel like this particular mystery adds credit to it too. Part of how Tao disguised herself as Jin was by pretending to be barely able to talk. And we've never heard Lolan talk at all. So I'm like, is that a connection to it? Could be. Also, someone around Lolan must have a top tier makeup artist with abilities if they're disguising her so well. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that was a really good point to bring up because Lolan has like 50 servants in her crew. I am sure that some of those 50 women have intense makeup abilities. So it's very possible. Now, somebody in the comments was like, there's no way that Lolan and Shisui could be the same person. They look too similar. That seems too obvious. I would agree with you normally, but with this series, I felt like, why make them look that similar if it's just a red herring? And also last season, it was like, Locket and MaoMao have the same eye color. That seems way too obvious that he could be her father. And then guess what happened? And then it's like, that woman has green hair just like MaoMao. There's no way she could be her mother. And then that's what happened. So I'm like, I don't know. Unless the show's figured out that we're onto it and it's intentionally throwing a red herring. Look, I don't care to be wrong. If I'm wrong and Shisui and Lolan are not the same people, I'm going to be totally fine with that. I just don't want people to tell me ahead of time. I want the show to tell me. That's all. So we'll see. But I thought that was a really good point about the makeup artist. I think that's an interesting point that Lolan has the resources at her disposal and has the story on her side at this point to make it to where she could be hiding as Shisui and getting intel on the side. We'll see. And then El Freya says for episode 3, the blue corpse mushrooms that MaoMao envisions at the end of the episode look really neat. Otherworldly, perhaps, like something you'd find deep down under the sea on the ocean floor. And I thought that was a really good description because last season, whenever MaoMao was talking about not feeling the traditional throes of love or not feeling any maternal instinct or anything, she would constantly say she lost that before she was even born. And it would go to her like being in the amniotic fluid, but it also was categorized as being underwater. So I feel like that idea of the ocean and drowning and being, submerged is very tied to MaoMao's symbolism with her character in the story. So I thought that was a really cool description to kind of go along with it. But yeah, so I really appreciate all y'all's comments below. I want to give a very quick shout out over to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon to thank you all so much for your support because I deeply appreciate it. So thank you, Alex Cornejo, Anime Annie, Be Happy, Bryant Reed, Dana, Damage3245, Danger Zone, Danny Donmai, Devorin, Destiny Marie, Ichu, Eric, as well as El Freya, Lyndon, Liam Poles, Matthew Palfinier, Murphy, Nicholas Nago, Sunspots, Shimoyama, Starman AA, Trails, and Translucent Men, as well as Ghostly Tournament Fi Show. I think I mentioned them. But thank you all so much for your support. I really appreciate it. All of my love. So yeah, we've talked for 10 minutes. I'm super excited to see what this episode gives us, but we're not going to waste any more time. We are going to dive right into episode, technically it's 28, but episode 4 of season 2 of Apothecary Diaries. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let us go. Well, this was a transition episode. This very much felt like a setup episode. It felt like it was setting up a lot of things to happen. And I was like, oh, okay. It was still a really good episode, but I was sitting there going, okay, why are we doing this? What is the point of this? What is this leading to? And the fact that Gaoshun is asking so many questions is very curious. So we need to go through this episode. But I will say, I'm going to be in the tradition of going back to the very start, where we look at the OP and we look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 10 images to see which ones we're going to see per episode. Definitely the Ox Bazor is the one in this episode. It's in the second row, the second one by the mushroom. That's the one for episode 4. So there you go. Looky there. So I'm very curious to see where we go to from here. Although at the very end of the episode, we did see a lunar moth. So I'm curious if that's going to come up later. But then we've also seen the frog as well as before. So I like this series pointing out little tiny imagery from this OP that you're like, okay, maybe we'll see that again. Also, the little note that looks like origami is interesting. The ribbon, the flowers, and then the flowers look like they have like little tiny flowers inside of them. I'm so curious. And then another looks like a stone, and then of course the hairpin. So at this point, I feel like the hairpin's going to be like one of the last ones because it's connected to Jinshi and MaoMao together. So it seems like an end of core thing. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so I'm surprised that we have the twins. Well, they're not twins. They're cousins. Cousins with the same grandfather. That seems interesting. That they're setting this up, the cousins who are similar. And so they each, which is curious, they each have 2 different kinds of earrings. They have 2 different types of veils with different color stones. They both seem like they have similar hairstyles, but we know from the OP they are a little bit different. Curious. I wondered for a brief second if we were going to go Game of Thrones and one of them was going to be a boy in disguise as a girl. And I was like, okay. Reminds me of another series that I've watched where they had the boy presenting as a girl. But I don't think that's the case. We're going to talk about that when we get into Gaoshun's detail here. But so there's the mirrors. The mirrors are behind the sheets and the guy is presenting and showing them the 4 mirrors. So I'm very curious to know if the mirrors have anything to do with them. Like if there's a point to the mirrors. Here's the thing. This is why I think it's very important that we have the mirrors and the one stands up. The one cousin stands up to move forward and goes along with the one guy, it seems. And we have people on different outposts. So that's curious. We have people on different outposts, which is very similar to what the story that Gaoshun has been telling, which we're going to get into here in a little bit. But then we have the one that stood up with the red talking to Lowland's dad. I think I have a theory about what's going on with this, but we're going to get into it when Gaoshun talks about the layout of the place and all of that. So we'll see. So yeah, so the mirrors. Why did I not realize there haven't been mirrors in this entire series so far? I kept thinking MaoMao was using a mirror when she put her makeup on. I don't know why I thought that. I don't know why I had that impression. I don't know if she'd been looking at a water basin when she put that on and that was making me think mirror in my head. Maybe that was it, but I did not imagine that they haven't had mirrors. It's kind of like when you realize, I'm going to talk about Banana Fish. Banana Fish is an amazing series. In that series, the manga takes place in the late 80s, but when MAPPA adapted it in 2019, it modernized it, but it does so in a way, it's such a great adaptation. Go watch Banana Fish if you've not watched it. But in that series, you would never know it's not from the 80s until you hear about it later. Like in the series, they update it, but there are little things that they don't include because they weren't around in the 80s that when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, they didn't have that in the series because it didn't make sense in the manga. That's why they didn't do that. So this is one of those things where you just don't, your brain doesn't connect that there's not been a mirror the whole time because you're just so used to seeing mirrors all the time. You just don't even think about it. It's just something you take for granted. And yeah, now these mirrors, they are beautiful. Floor-length mirrors are pretty expensive, especially if they're ornate and have all these beautiful details. Like I love the blue sapphire and burnt orange. They complement each other so much that I love the little intricate details. It feels very, I don't want to say Moroccan. I don't want to get that wrong. It feels very, I don't want to say Middle Eastern because I don't want to get the culture wrong, but it feels of that area, which would tie into the envoy in the desert and the camels and the kind of the symbolism we've seen so far. But they're beautiful. Also tying into the idea of using mirrors. I feel like mirrors are such a cool introduction into a Sherlock-esque story because there's so many tricks you can pull with mirrors. Mirrors are very symbolic of reflections. They're very symbolic of showing people being two-faced or hiding appearances, which ties a lot into this series. I feel like symbolically and thematically, you can do a lot with a mirror in a story and a narrative. And so this episode being called Mirror makes a lot of sense. But I can't believe that we haven't had one this entire time. I like that MaoMao's first thought is being like, can we market this? Girl's already made an MLM out of essential oils. Now she's going to start marketing mirrors. Locken, do you realize your daughter is an entrepreneur ahead of her time? Like, girl has got a side business. She's got a side hustle every which way. Getting mushrooms to sell as therapeutic medicinal purposes. Like, MaoMao's, keep her in lock, Jinshi, because she's going to be out selling and swindling everybody. So she's like, we can make a lot of money if we mass produce this. So I also realized the fact that they're talking about how expensive mirrors are and the fact that they're very hard at that time to make and to market. And there was like a big trade monopoly on them seemingly makes me wonder if the whole like 7 years bad luck if you break a mirror was really tied to the fact that these mirrors are really freaking expensive. Don't break one because they're hard to come by, and making them have a tie to bad luck would be, you know, a way to keep people from just being willy-nilly with a mirror. Maybe, or something to scare children. Scaring children with stories, we've never done that before in history. But yeah, so the quack doctor talked about the envoy, saying the caravan was part of the special envoy, and it has a lot to do, and they say they gave one of these mirrors to all the high-ranking concubines, including Gokyo, as a special envoy would have to treat them fairly, meaning if we're going to give one to one, we're going to give them to all the others. Now, here is something that I think is important to keep note. When we're going to talk about Lowland in this. Again, my Shisui and Lowland theory. I'm going to keep it going. I'm not letting it go until I'm proven wrong, so y'all are just going to have to deal with that. But I do want to make note. The one woman that is behind Lowland when they give her the mirror and kind of lowers her head, there are a lot of women in Lowland's a company that have very similar face shapes, very similar eye shapes, very similar hairstyles. I don't think that's by accident. I feel like they intentionally make Lowland as unemotional and mute as possible to contrast how excited and carefree and happy Shisui is. I feel like that is by design. I feel like it's intentional. They don't want us to make that connection between the two of them. I could be totally wrong. I'm ready to be wrong. But I feel like it's interesting, right? So yeah, whether it was over the desert or by the sea. They talk about for them to go through all of that for the concubines means they're going to be starting a big business deal. Yeah, usually if we're going to suck up to the emperor and get all of his high-ranking concubines a really nice gift, it means, oh, hey, look at this amazing thing that we gave you. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we made this deal? I mean, Jinshi and MaoMao are doing the small-scale version of that with him getting her the Ox Bezor in exchange for her services, so it's not unreasonable to think that that's part of it. I do like the fact that Gyokyo is wearing the more billowy, bigger robes to kind of hide her pregnancy, and they're masking it as part of the fashion and the trend going through. I think that that's a clever thing for them to do. But like I said, we'll talk more about Lowland and Shisui later. So Gaoshun comes in by himself to talk to MaoMao. Now, I think it's interesting that Gaoshun says that it's him that has a request for her. I don't know if he says that because he's not sure if MaoMao would cooperate if she knew it was Jinshi without Jinshi being there, and would be suspicious of it and would question further. So him saying that it's his request makes it kind of more finite, but it also makes it seem less priority if it's Gaoshun asking about it. It very much feels like Gaoshun is trying to say, hey, asking for a friend, not me, not anything that Jinshi and I are dealing with. Don't think anything about it. Don't think this is a high priority case. Don't think it's tied to national security. It's just a little quandary, just a little question. I just brought this map of the layout and wanted to ask you this very hypothetical yet complex scenario to see if you can figure it out. I feel like it's very intentional. I do think that Gaoshun came on behalf of Jinshi. I think that Gaoshun downplays it a lot so that MaoMao does not get involved, because I do think Jinshi does not want to get MaoMao involved. And we've seen that throughout this season so far, that Jinshi wants to keep MaoMao's participation in all of these affairs as minimal as possible, probably because last season when MaoMao got really hurt, Jinshi felt really bad about it. So he realizes that we're going to get into what my theory is about all of this, but I think because of this theory, Jinshi does not want MaoMao involved because he thinks that it is a very high stakes, very dangerous mission. What they are trying to uncover has a lot of very dark layers to it, and he does not want to get MaoMao implicated because she could end up in a lot of trouble. So Gaoshun showing up with this hypothetical situation is just his way of trying to be like, I'm just a eunuch that's got this random story I want to, get your opinion about, and just play it off as low key as possible. Props to Hongmian for watching over MaoMao and saying, you, sir, are not going to be alone in a room with her. Like, good for her, because even though Gaoshun is a respected eunuch and official in the court, Hongmian's like, it's inappropriate for a young woman to be. And I don't think Hongmian thinks that Gaoshun would try anything with MaoMao, and I don't think that she believes that MaoMao would try anything with Gaoshun. But Hongmian knows that MaoMao can be a little bit like out there and eccentric, and I think that she is worried if someone would hear MaoMao and Gaoshun's conversation by themselves, they might take the wrong implication from it. And again, Hongmian is looking out for MaoMao, just like Jinshi and Gaoshun are looking out for her. And Hongmian doesn't want MaoMao to be implicated in a bad situation. So she's like, nope, I'm going to stay here and be here. But poor Hongmian. When Hongmian, what does MaoMao say? She's like, oh, well, is it a difficult topic? And he says, yes, we need to be private. And she's like, oh, well, then you're not going to be by yourself. And she's like, I shouldn't say anything. She said I shouldn't be alone with him. But she lost all interest once she found out Gaoshun had a wife and child. So, interesting. So, MaoMao knows that Gaoshun has a wife and child, which is curious. Although, like we talked last season, it was very common for adults. It didn't seem that way. Like, most eunuchs became eunuchs at a young age because the healing process was easier, and because it was, if you're going to build your way up through the ranks, then you might as well do it while you're young and have a lot more time. But it was not uncommon for prisoners of war and for people who were older to become a eunuch after the fact because of their situation. So I'm sure MaoMao doesn't think twice about Gaoshun becoming eunuch after having a wife and child. I don't think she knows about Basin being his son, because that's not been explicitly said. To MaoMao anyway, I don't think. But I don't think MaoMao bats an eye at the fact that Gaoshun has a wife and kid, because she's like, well, he could have became a eunuch after the fact for whatever reason. But poor Hongmian. Hongmian's like, she thought Gaoshun was single and she was gonna mingle, and then poor her being like, it's always the good ones. I hear you, Hongmian. I hear you loud and clear. We all are going after Gaoshun, so makes sense. So she's like, well, I don't know if I can help you, but what have you got in mind? And he says, well, an acquaintance of mine is very concerned. Asking for a friend. I can't imagine who this acquaintance of his is. It's a very strange situation. But a family, now it says a family has 2 daughters, which again, 2 daughters, technically they're cousins, but they're both daughters, of children of the grandfather who's connected to this envoy. Here's my theory. After, I didn't think about it in the reaction so much, but after seeing the episode full circle as a whole, and going back and seeing that opening where they have the guards stationed to watch the 2 in the envoy, my theory is that the 2 cousins are there, and this story is about the 2 cousins. And I think that it's not that one's sneaking out to get pregnant necessarily, but it could be. We're going to talk about that. But I think that one of 2 scenarios. Either one of the cousins is sneaking out to try and maybe get with the emperor, possibly to implicate them. I'm like 20% on that theory. But my theory is, instead of getting pregnant, my theory is one of the cousins, like we saw at the very beginning of this episode, is sneaking out to meet with Lolan's dad, and they're plotting stuff against the emperor and against the palace behind everybody's back while they're here. It would make sense because when else are the envoy going to get with Lolan's dad? When else are they going to see him? This is the prime opportunity to do so. If they're going to put things in motion while they're here, now would be the time for them to meet with him. So if they're meeting with the dad of Lolan, they could use the mirrors to set up and have the guards think that it's one of them when it's not, and they could sneak out to go meet with him, as what happens at the very beginning of this episode. We see one of the twins meeting with Lolan's dad. I think the mirrors have been put there as a means of, it's kind of like hiding in plain sight. If we give mirrors to everybody, then the presence of a mirror won't seem weird. Like if they see them bring in a mirror into the twins or the cousins' room, they won't be like, wow, what's that one mirror doing here when all the other concubines have mirrors? Then they'll just be like, oh, it's just part of their wardrobe. Makes total sense. And nobody will question it as being a tool that they're using to deceive the guards, right? And the cousins look very, very similar, and to the point where you'd have to really get up close to see the difference. So that would be easy to fool a guard. And then if the one's going out, I think that Lolan's dad is plotting something against the emperor for whatever reason. For whatever reason, I think Lolan's dad's plotting something against the palace, against the emperor. I don't know what it is, but I think he is plotting something. I think Lolan has been planted there as a way for him to be in the rear palace because he's like, I'm just coming to see my daughter. And then he meets with the cousin, right? I think that all of this is very strategic for Lolan to come at the right time, for Lolan to be there, for the envoy to show up not that long afterwards, for her to have established time. I think that Lolan is Shisui and she's been patrolling the palace and making the rounds and getting information behind the scenes. Whether she reports all that back to her dad or not, we'll see. But I think that it's all set up. And this story Gaoshun is trying to find out from MaoMao is, how would these cousins be getting out of the palace at night to go possibly do spy work or do espionage or things under the scenes? And MaoMao literally just told them how he would do it, how they could do it. And I think the layout that he presented, the schematic that he laid down to show how the rooms and stuff were set up, is what we saw at the beginning of the episode, where it showed the guard station, and Gaoshun's like, okay, so let's just say, here's where they've been kept while they're here at the rear palace. How would they get out? And MaoMao just told him all he needed to know. So I feel like that's what this entire story was, that the cousins were by themselves, that the story's been about their cousins. I thought for a second that part of the story could relate to Jinshi, like the idea of Jinshi kind of being sheltered as a kid, because we've seen Kid him in the OP. But the more it went on, it's like, oh no, this is about the cousins and them being watched over, which is akin to how this setup is here, right? So we'll see if that actually plays out and if that's actually true. I do feel bad for the cousins in a sense, because I had two friends. I've talked about this in another series, but I had two friends growing up in high school that from grade school to high school, they were identical twin sisters. And growing up, I thought it was kind of weird growing up, but they always had like matching clothes. Just one would be one color and one would be the other color. They had matching hairdos. They dressed exactly the same every day. It was like one would wear pink overalls, one would wear purple overalls. It was like the same clothes, same style. Like up until they were in high school, they dressed the same every day. Same haircut and everything. And finally in high school, one of the twins got tired of it and she like chopped her hair off and dyed it a different color, and they started wearing different clothes. She was like, I just had enough. And now they both are, it's funny, I see pictures of them as adults and they dress totally different and have different hairstyles, and they're just totally, they finally look like different people. But I think they just finally reached a breaking point of like, I don't want to dress like my sister exactly the same every day anymore. So yeah, I felt bad for them in this, where I kind of feel a little bit like they don't have any autonomy, right? So I like that MaoMao's like, how am I supposed to solve this? She's like, why? She's like, did people sneak them out? And he's like, no. So they do talk about false pregnancies in this episode and about if it's possible. And yeah, it is definitely possible to have a false pregnancy. I love that Hongmian's like, could it have been a servant man that they were with? Although, ever since last season, MaoMao is not technically a servant girl. She'd like to believe that she's a servant girl, and I guess because her mom was a concubine, that would lower her status. But her dad's like a top-ranking military official, so she's got something in there for her. But the scandal, the pearl clutching of Hongmian being like, what if it was a servant boy? And Gaoshun's like, no. He says they weren't allowed to approach the room even if they were monitoring them. So then they're like, is it possible to become pregnant without seeing a man? And MaoMao's like, yes. I feel like the whole false pregnancy thing is kind of a red herring. I don't think either of the cousins is actually pregnant. I think that's just... I think that MaoMao's speech here about the false pregnancy is also to talk about how the body can trick itself to believing various things. If you will it hard enough, it can happen, right? Kind of like a placebo effect. So, which could possibly relate to the medicine and Jinshi using it and the added effect of it. Like, I'm sure the medicine like decreases his sex drive and everything, but I'm sure that if you really wanted to have it, maybe it could happen. I don't know. But yeah, I know from experience that lots of things can make your body act in different ways. For women, if you exercise heavy or you're constantly under stress, it can affect like periods and things like that. Like I know my cycles have been totally messed up if I was over exercising or super stressed. So it's very possible. And people have had false pregnancies before. Like it's not an uncommon thing to happen. A strongly held belief can have a powerful effect on the body. Indeed, I'm sure that's not going to be foreshadowing for anything. And she's like, are you sure the younger daughter was pregnant? And he says, well, let's just say she was. So he's like, that. I like that he's like, that the whole pregnancy thing is just an excuse to get you to show me how she got past surveillance. It's not an actual case. It's just we just want to know how she got around security because we're curious about that in our own situation right now. We don't think that she's getting pregnant, but we think that she's sneaking around with somebody else and could possibly committing espionage. So yeah, this whole layout and everything is akin to, I'm sure, where they're staying at while they're in the palace. It's just very intriguing. And then she goes and gets the mirror to do that. So she's like, he's not telling me everything. I like that MaoMao is trying to figure out why Gaoshun is being secretive and if he's holding back information. And around this time, I love MaoMao being like, or she's like, I can't quite think of what to do. And she's like, I want to ask certain details, but she's like, I don't know if it's appropriate if I do. And Hongmian's right here. So she's like, I don't know if I should really do it. And then Gaoshun gives us the connector by saying, oh, by the way, here's the ox Bazor you wanted. It was more expensive than it originally was. The demand suddenly went up. And you know what? He also says that I've heard recently that Jinshi has been gifted many rare medicines from all sorts of people. Now, is obviously Jinshi, as Hongmian knows him here, is not the emperor's son. And so he's not being gifted the things as like a marriage proposal or anything. But rather, that tells me Jinshi's collecting all sorts of rare medicines from around different people so that he can bribe MaoMao with them. He's collecting all these medicines so he can bribe MaoMao into helping him, which is absolutely hilarious. Or he could be planning to give them to her as gifts. Maybe there's a very kind gesture element to it, but he's going to bribe her with those. But it is possible. And I love that Gaoshun's like, don't please. And she's like, oh, rumor has it he's searching quite passionately for them. And he's like, stop. Gaoshun's like, please. He's like, let's not talk about this. He's like, anyway. I love Gaoshun's like, whoa, we're not going to talk about how passionately he's searching for these medicines. Just anyway, take it. So I am glad that Jinshi was not around to see MaoMao's reaction to the ox Bazor, or his ability to be considered a eunuch would be called severely into question, because MaoMao's face when she gets that ox Bazor and how orgasmic her face looks, she's just, I've never seen her look that animated and happy and excited about anything. And Gaoshun's like, well, I'm glad you like it. Master Jinshi wanted to deliver it to you personally, but here we are. And I'm sure Gaoshun knows how much she appreciates it. And Gaoshun sees how much it affects her. So I'm sure Gaoshun will relay the message, but we are very lucky. Jinshi would be banging his head up against the table and taking all the cold showers if he saw her reaction to that. Trust and believe. So yeah, so she goes back and gets the mirror and shows how it would be very easy to fool someone if the mirror was there, and especially if it was an entire like mirror that could cover the length of the window, you wouldn't necessarily know that it's there. Like, people have done that trick in the past as well. Also, the needlework thing is great. I wondered how in the world people were paying attention to exactly what they were doing needlework with, but you very much can have two things that look similar to one another if you flip them over. So that part makes sense, right? Interesting. And she's like, the mirror that the envoy brought was so beautiful. From a distance, it would be hard to tell reality. I feel like the whole thing with needlework being common, it connected to my mother in the 90s was obsessed with cross stitch. I feel like in the 90s in America, there was a huge cross stitch trend and everybody was doing cross stitch. I tried it for like a day, but I hate needles. I'm phobic with them. I stab myself too many times with them, and I wasn't very good at it. But my mom really liked cross stitch and she was good at it for a while, but it was just so tedious. I'm like, this is boring. I did not see the appeal of it, but I know a lot of people actually like it. So she's like, okay, maybe the cousin is carrying a bigger secret. Maybe she was carrying a bigger secret instead of a child. I think that's what this is. I think the cousin is sneaking out, meeting with Lolan's dad. They're plotting something, and Gaoshun is trying to figure out how are they getting out, and is it possible? Because again, this series tells us we need evidence, not just conjecture. And I realize my whole Lolan and Shisui comment and theory is complete conjecture, and I'm fully transparently aware of it. But Gaoshun in this case is like, we can't just go assuming that the cousins are committing espionage and that they're plotting against the emperor without solid evidence. This, at least, MaoMao explaining how they could do it gives them a place to start gathering evidence that if they corner the cousins and say, here's what you're doing, then they're going to be able to kind of narrow it down and get them in a corner. Maybe. And of course, MaoMao's like, I'm not going to question and get myself too involved. I think that's a good thing. And she has the Ox Bezor to kind of keep her occupied, which I think is definitely by design from Jinshi, that he wants to give that to her to keep her away from the scenario right now. Because again, this is a high profile situation. You have some major trading partners, some major envoys with political power dealing with a possible, like saying that they are committing treason and going against the emperor is a huge statement to make. And if you aren't ready to back that up, there could be a lot of dire consequences. So I don't know how to feel about it. I feel really nervous about all this because there's a lot at stake. And so then we go back to Gaoshun and Jinshi, and they're like an otherworldly beauty that sheds pearls as tears. The high-ranking official in charge of the welcoming party is begging for help. And Jinshi's like, why? This is so ridiculous. And Gaoshun's like, you don't need to stress yourself out anymore, And he's like, I know. But he's like, it's not just the mirrors. What are the envoys thinking? So we have these two situations going on. We have the mirrors that are possibly connected to them spying around and working behind the scenes. And they're using the mirrors as this literally smoke and mirrors. Literally. And then we have the moon fairy, which is a totally different thing that is possibly connected to all of this, but how? And Jinshi's like, what is going on? Why are these two things connected? So Jinshi goes to ask MaoMao for help because he can't do it alone. And I love that Gokyo's like, I'm going to be present for this. I'm going to see the tea. I want to see what my future brother-in-law is saying about this. And he's like, have you heard the story of the otherworldly beauty who sheds pearls as tears? Now, MaoMao has this little look on her face like she's looking at Jinshi incredulously. But when we go back to his face, he's like, what is it? And there's all the sparkles around him. She literally says, I'd love to say there's an otherworldly beauty in front of me right here. Girl. Gyokyo knows. Gyokyo sees it. Gyokyo can see right through everything. She's like, MaoMao is talking about you. MaoMao's thinking about you right now, Jinshi. Like, Gyokyo gets it. She knows what we're thinking. I'm like, we the audience like, MaoMao, You just said in your head that you think that Jinshi is an otherworldly beauty. Like, you are just literally in front of us saying how handsome you think he is. And he has literal sparkles all around him. Girl. And you know Gaoshun is in the back like... And so she says, what do you mean pearls as tears? That part is a little bit like odd. And he's like, well, I don't know the details, but we have the idea of this moon fairy who danced as if, and lights danced with her as if, when she danced, lights danced with her as if blessing her. Which seems to me like fireflies. Like maybe fireflies. When she cried, the tears turned into pearls as they fell down. Okay. She was a courtesan from the pleasure. It seemed like fireflies. Like I'm thinking of Drag Race, where there was an unfortunate season like finale where one of the drag queens was like, she was gonna like open up her dress and butterflies were gonna come out, kind of like that. But unfortunately she didn't time it right. And like the butterflies just died, which is terrible. But it was like, oh, that was poorly conceived. So to me, it looks like she opens up her robes and as she's dancing, fireflies like come out and they look like little like tears. But fireflies are like a warmer light and this is a colder light. So I'm not sure how we're going to get that across, but maybe, possibly. So then they talk about the moon fairy and the envoy from the west told the envoy's grandfather told them about the story of the moon fairy over and over again. Like they were so impressed by it. Like it was this big, exotic, extravagant experience that they had to, see happen. So I love that we get the brothel owner's background, that she was this tall, voluptuous, beautiful courtesan, a dancer from the pleasure district known as the Moon Fairy. I also love that the old brothel owner, her little head bun is the same when she was younger as it is when she was older. Now, granted, they kind of make fun of how different she looks, but I'm like, 50 years, if she was 20 years old when this happened in the past, that means she's like in her 70s now. Unfortunately, people don't retain their youthful beauty through their 70s. Like, you do age. So, but I love the fact that it's her. I love that we're getting, like, it ties to her in the OP. I love that we're getting that about her. Amazing. I love that she's the old lady of the Verdigris house. Yes. And I like that Gyokyo's like, oh, what's she like? And Jinshi's like, well, she's kind of crass and rude and a shrewd businesswoman, but okay, cool. She reminds me of the lead owner of the geisha house in Memoirs of a Geisha. She reminds me a lot of her. Where she's like, pumpkin, So they didn't seem satisfied. The two envoys were not satisfied with the women they brought in to possibly dance, which they all look like voluptuous women. They just weren't tall enough and did not seem elegant enough. I thought at the beginning, when they were talking about dancing, that they were going to have MaoMao be the moon fairy because MaoMao is a really good dancer. And Jinshi has seen MaoMao dancing, so he would know that firsthand. So I thought for a while they were going to be like, well, who could we get be the moon fairy? What is it about the moon fairy that entranced them? And it was the dance. So I thought that they were going to be like, well, MaoMao, you can dance really good. Maybe you can be the moon fairy, and maybe that's it. But then they kept talking about how they needed to be really tall and voluptuous, and it's like, well, MaoMao is not tall and voluptuous. So even though she can dance really good, that's not going to work. I think they're going to dress Jinshi in drag, and they're going to just dress Jinshi in drag because he's tall and has a very feminine features, and they're going to have him be the moon fairy, and MaoMao could teach him how to dance. Can we have that? Can we have MaoMao teaching Jinshi how to dance? Can we do that? I would have loved that if MaoMao's like, okay, you got 2 left feet, let's dance. That could be so romantic. Can we have that happen? Can we have MaoMao teaching Jinshi to dance as the moon fairy? I would love that. Now, MaoMao talks in this one little moment about this, that she's like, that's why Jinshi asked me to come and help. He has beauty that would press anyone and is technically a man. He does have what it takes to make women go head over heels for him, but that could cause trouble too, because what if the cousin took his seduction seriously and had him stay over? He wouldn't be able to deliver. Well, that's a big problematic element because technically Jinshi can deliver, even if he's too young and inexperienced to know what to do. If one of the cousins caught him in a corner, he could technically be forced to try to have sex with him, which sounds awful, and he doesn't seem to have any desire to do so. So, but being a special envoy as a woman must have taught that cousin that to refrain from such careless acts. But it's a risk worth avoiding. Now, here's my thing. What if these cousins are not into men? And what if Jinshi does the thing as the moon fairy, and then the cousins are like, actually, we're all down. I'm like, oh no! If the cousins are lesbians, or one of them is, and Jinshi is out there dancing like a woman, they might be like, well, actually, we can make this work. And they're like, oh no! What happens if that's the case? I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But Jinshi's like, yeah, this envoy is actually really important, and there's a lot at stake here. Both nations want to advance talk of new trades. So now here, MaoMao's like, I see. She says, I hear in distant lands, marriages take place across international lines, causing beautiful men and women to become quite commonplace. So for someone from such a nation to call someone a moon fairy, did she put hallucinogens in the incense? I think that it's the spectacle. I think it's whatever the fireflies or their equivalent is going to be. And the fact that they were beautiful, did the dance, it was something unique. I mean, if you've ever watched Drag Race, that's kind of the appeal, is to see someone use their talents to perform something that you never will see again. So I feel like there's been certain elements of, like, there's been lip syncs I've seen on Drag Race where certain moves have been done, certain gimmicks have been pulled that you can't ever see replicated. And it's like, oh, that's that one person's thing. So I feel like this is kind of the same situation. Now, I don't know what this is going to do if Jinshi is the moon fairy, how that's going to go over, or what's going to happen with that. But I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see next episode. I'm really curious. And Jinshi's like, I'm grasping at straws. They want this to happen. We want everything to go well. This is basically Blue Roses all over again. Like Locken's like, well, I guess if you get Blue Roses in time for the garden party, but I mean, if you can, it's not a big deal. It's just you'll look like an idiot. And now it's the same thing, only it's this moon fairy business. And Jinshi's like, this isn't something we can cultivate. We need to find exactly how this is going to fit. And lo and behold, all the pieces were right in front of us from the start. I love that the owner of the brothel is not impressed. Where she's like, where's my lap dance? Where's my guys serving me tea? Where's going on? Where's my money for being here? Like, I love her. She's so sassy. I love how just demanding she is. So she talks about how the last time when all this took place was the time of the emperor before the previous one. Oh God. So timeline wise, this is like Jinshi's great grandfather. This is the emperor's grandfather. You need a damn family tree to keep track of this. But yeah, so this has been from a while back. What's interesting is Lolan's dad was involved with the emperor's mother. But this whole moon fairy business is from the emperor's mother's father-in-law. So we're getting deep back into the family tree with all of this, which is very curious. So they talked about, all I could think about when they were talking about the castle and everything being built and like built upon ruins. I kept thinking of Monty Python, where they're like, we built that castle and then it sank into the swamp. And then we built it and sank into the swamp again. But the third one stood. Just like, that's all I could think about in that moment was that monologue. And how they talk about that the stage, when everything happened by this orchard, MaoMao's like, oh, well, there was a ruined orchard on the north side of the rear palace. Everything's happening in this abandoned north side. Like, Shisui's been hanging out there, talking about things smelling. There's been corpses there. Everything's just, it's the rear palace is Australia. Everything's been left there to happen, secluded from everything else. Wild things are featured. We always talked about how Australia has all these crazy animals that are terrifying, like bird-eating spiders, and it freaks me out. And I'm like, just everything is on Australia that just couldn't escape and go anywhere else. It's wild. But anyway, no offense to Australians. I would like to go there one day. But it's not out of the question that the party venue might now be a part of the rear palace, right? I mean, that was 50 years ago. Correct. So I love the brothel owner also defends herself. She was like, I was a high class courtesan, thank you very much. I was, head of my time. How dare you say, things like that. Why wouldn't I be well sought out? But I also like the fact that she's so resourceful. She talks about the fact that she was super tall, super curvaceous, and she's like, it made her stand out as the main dancer, which Jinshi could stand out as well. My thing is, how are they going to convince the other dancers and them to not know it's Jinshi? Like, is Jinshi going, and is the brothel owner going to be like, hey, sir, if you don't have any other side gigs going on, and he's like, I'm literally the emperor's brother's son. So she also talks about they had to plan everything, like the phases of the moon, which the moonlight, you would want a full moon to get the most like visual appeal. I could understand that. And remove obstacles to give guests a better view. So they talked about the nearby orchard meant lots of insects. So they plucked every single larva from the leaves. That is extremely tedious. Plucking insects by lamplight. What? But they ended up getting insects around the torches anyway. So they're still into being insects regardless. And she's like, after all that work, there were idiots that tampered with my costume last night. And they put like rubbed insect carcasses on it. That's so, what a bitchy move. What a bitchy move. I love that we get to see her face when she's younger. She was very pretty. And to see her be like, how dare you? She's like, I was too tough for them. I used my outfit to skillfully hide it. I love it. She's like, I'll make it work. It felt like a very MaoMao thing to do, right? The audience ate it up, and the idiot seemed so angry. And MaoMao's like, yes, you've told this story many times. She's like, have some respect. I love that even in her outfit as an old woman, she incorporates the idea of the sash and everything that she used in the one dance. I love that. So then she has the painting of herself, which, from what we saw of her in the flashback, the artist's rendition, should we be surprised that he made June be busting out all over? Like, he made her boobs like at least a cup size even bigger than they were originally. I love that she's like, yeah, artistic liberties, eh? But again, that does say something about memory, that the envoy, that the grandfather, his memory of the event is probably, very biased based on his emotions at that time. And the image, the painting that was commissioned just kind of exemplifies that. So she's like, nothing, I'm fine. I'm not going to say that the painting was, exaggerating anything. The envoy never set foot in our land again, but he sent this to me through the caravan. And she's like, but you were just doing your job, right? So why did he like you so much? And I love that she's like, I don't know. She's like, I was just doing my job. People like what they like. She's like, how am I supposed to know otherwise? I love she blows the smoke in MaoMao's face, and MaoMao's like, well, the old lady can see things objectively. She probably isn't exaggerating. But even if she was beautiful back then, what caused them to call her a goddess? And it's probably the dance, and they show like the little lights around her as she danced, like the fireflies. Again, it was probably just the beauty of it. I love Jinshi looking at the painting later, and he's like, not my type. Too tall and busty for Jinshi. And they're like, all we can think of is finding someone like her in the portrait. I'm surprised they didn't recommend one of the princesses, because wasn't one of them pretty tall? But maybe they aren't as tall as I think they are. And maybe taking them out of the brothel owner would be like, no, they have their own business. We're not helping you, even though it's the emperor. So I don't know. But it is Jinshi, not technically the emperor. So I'm sure the emperor knows nothing about this plan, which is wild to me. And MaoMao's like, finding a tall woman that can dance on such short notice would be a problem. So they say 175 centimeters. 175 centimeters is 68.8 inches. And so that would be, let's see, 175 is 5'7". That, to say tall, I'm 5'8". So they're looking for someone about my height or taller. So, I mean, 5'8" is pretty tall for a woman, I guess, especially if you had heels or something on, I suppose. But I was like, 175 centimeters isn't insanely tall for a woman, but still 5'8", I guess. And so she was a skilled dancer, and so her long limbs made her look even better. And so they're like, well, we'd have to find someone that was tall, and the envoys are about 5'8", so that makes sense. And being that beauty. And then that's when MaoMao realizes there's more than one envoy. So she's possibly connecting the story that Gaoshun was telling to this. And they say that they are cousins with the same grandfather. So it's not unreasonable to think that they wouldn't look similar. And she's like, the envoys must be quite pretty as well. Whose beauty would impress another beauty. And that's when she looked up and saw Jinshi. And Gaoshun's like, I think I know where we're going with this. And Jinshi's like, we're going with this way, aren't we? What are you trying to say? So meanwhile, we go back to this scene here where the Emperor is having a very awkward evening with Lolan. Another awkward evening where he's like, I can't read her. I don't want to do things with her. Bye. There's like such a distance between them where I feel like, okay, if you told me that because we see Lolan and Shisui at the same time in different places, that it must mean they are two separate people, I would totally understand where you're coming from. And that is fair. And if this is the moment where we find out that Lolan and Shisui are two separate people, and that's and that was giving it away to us, I understand. But I'm going to keep my little conjecture because one, there is this distance between the Emperor and Lolan, so he can't get close to her. Also, the ambiance, she has like low-lit candles, lots of shadows. It's not easy to see. That seems to lend to the whole thing of trying to fool someone. And then she's dressed up in her little British Victorian waif garb. And we see her there. Also, look at this handmaiden that is right next to Lolan. Look at them. They have the same face shape, same eyes. Lolan is covering up her mouth, like you can't fully see it. They look so similar. And I feel like that's by design. Like their hair colors are different. But again, the candlelight makes it harder to see. They do have different eye colors, but that just seems like it is intentional to show us how easy it would be for her to fool the Emperor and everybody else that it's not her. Because then who do we cut to from her? By the way, we cut to the old abandoned orchard where this all was taking place at, and we see all the bugs by lantern light, and who's doing the same thing as what happened before? Shisui. Who's doing the same thing? Yeah. And we see her with her hair and again, the lantern light makes it harder to see her hair and eye color. And she's gathering all the bugs up into her own little trap. And then she sees a lunar moth fly by that looks super pretty. And the lunar moth is kind of the same color as the little ball of light that was in the painting and everything. So I wonder if maybe instead of fireflies, because the fireflies are like a more greenish glow, a warmer glow. I wonder if they would maybe catch these lunar moths and let them go. If that would make the same kind of appear, which are lunar moths, moon fairy, lunar moths. I don't know. I just feel like her collecting all the bugs. I feel like this whole thing with Shisui, you have Gaoshun and MaoMao and Jinshi planning all this out with the bugs and everything, and the story of the moon fairy. You also have the cousins going to Lolan's dad, possibly telling them the story of the moon fairy. You have Shisui, who just happens to be gathering insects in the same way that this all was possibly happening 50 years ago. Seems a big coincidence. Seems a big coincidence that Shisui, of all people, is doing similar methods to what was done back then, unless she knew the story passed down to her from her dad, from the envoy. I'm just saying, there's a lot of coincidences, a lot of connections happening that seem a little bit coincidental. Now, the one thing is they go up to the moon there, and the moon it's a half moon instead of a full moon. So the time between a half moon to full moon. How long does that take for that to happen? A week. It takes, the moon phases occur once a month, rising and sticking around for approximately 7 days before going into the moon phases. So, how long does it take to go? Okay, so it says from a half moon to a full moon. Well, it does say, interesting. Average time between moon phases. I want to see the whole moon phases. Like, how long does it take between each phase of the moon? Like, how many days between each phase? It says the cycle repeats once every 30 days, right? But that's from new moon to new moon. So, I mean, how many days between each moon phase? Days between moon phases. Yeah, I wish they would tell me if it was like a week or certain days, right? I want to know how long each lunar phase is. So is it 3? Okay, it takes about 3.5 days for the moon to move from one phase to the next. Okay, yes. And usually, okay, so if we have the phases of the moon there and it was a half moon, if we did that, then from a half moon, it basically would be a week, okay, between the half moon and a full moon. Perfect. So, I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that they wouldn't be hanging out for a week. That would make sense. So if we had a week to go before the envoy wanted this to happen, they've traveled all this way. They're going to wait a week, right? They're going to make a big festival out of it. Then that would give Jinshi time to learn the dance. That would give Jinshi time to get in the costume. That would have time for all of this to take place. And for the possibly the insects they're gathering to maybe become lunar moths. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. But I'm really excited. This episode was a transition episode and a setup episode, but it was a really good one. And there was a lot happening in it. And I'm really excited to see where we go to from here. So I'm looking forward to your comments and below about this episode in particular. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back very soon with more of the Apothecary Diaries.